it's kind of overwhelming. It was really overwhelming to me. It felt like it almost took me out of my body. It took me out of, feeling like I understood anything around me, because those pieces that I've always sought as like safety and comfort, which is the outdoors, is the mountains, they they were gone.
Hi, everyone. This is Aletta, founder and creative director of Our Climate Voices. Climate Change is Personal is our new podcast, where we're listening to people's personal experiences with the climate crisis and learning from their wisdom about how to create a future that is resilient, community-based, and centers the leadership of people on the front lines of the crisis. For those of you who are new to Our Climate Voices, we are a collective led by young, queer and trans folks, BIPOC, and disabled people working to humanize the climate crisis, catalyze systemic change, and vision the future that we want to make real. We know that climate change at its core is a social justice issue rather than an individual consumer problem. We also know that the oil and gas industry and other powerful interests have profited off of climate lies for decades and invested in strategies to convince us to fight climate crises as individuals rather than as a collective. Those in power know that we are more powerful together, and they are afraid of us acting collectively. So, we mobilize our personal experiences with climate change to hold those who profit from the climate destruction accountable, and we share our collective wisdom about how to embody a resilient, interdependent, and just future. Today, we're listening to the brilliant Callie Welch, a 34-year-old rural, working-class, disabled veteran of the U.S. Army. Callie is an overwhelmingly proud auntie and aspiring photographer living in small-town Montana. Today, she'll share her personal experience at the intersection of disability justice, rural justice, economic justice, and climate justice. Climate change is personal to Callie because she saw firsthand how disability creates vulnerabilities to climate disasters like wildfires, and how cycles of poverty make climate change increasingly challenging. Callie advocates for herself and for others within the disability community and enjoys the beautiful mountains of Montana whenever her body allows her. Callie, I'm so grateful that you're sharing your story with us today.
My name is Callie Welch. I am a 34-year-old disabled veteran of the U.S. Army. So when I think about growing up in Montana and what kind of made me fall in love with nature and made me fall in love with this idea of the earth as kind of like a being and something that is a part of our lives, not just something that like we're here to take advantage of. I think about camping at a lake called Canyon Ferry, just outside of Helena, where I grew up. And there's very little light pollution out there. I mean, there's a lot more now than there used to be. So that's kind of another, piece of it all too. But I remember, I mean, it's one of my most formative memories is being up late in the summer and sitting out at the lake with the water just being so smooth and being surrounded by these huge mountains, and then looking up at the night sky and being able to see the Milky Way just stretch all the way across the sky. I, I, I mean, there's always been a feeling of that. There's this kind of peace and centeredness that comes with seeing the Milky Way that has always been with me. It's always sat with me, and it's the kind of feeling that has been reflected in a lot of um, others when they see the Milky Way for the first time. There's so many people I know who've never experienced that, who grew up maybe in bigger cities, and have only seen pictures of the Milky Way, and then when they see it for the first time, there's this kind of feeling of like your breath catching. And there's this feeling of just complete awe, and I get it every time I see it. And I mean, it's still one of those, if I'm feeling overwhelmed or stressed or like I can't just kind of sit with everything the world is going through, I go find a really dark place and I sit with the night sky, and I feel this sense of like calm and connection that I can't really get anywhere else. So my disability story itself is kind of a long one. It really symptomology started when I was in the Army. So that's back in 2004. I was 18 and I was living in Germany, and what I found is I was just sick all the time. So it was at first it was just nausea every night. Every night I would have these horrible stomach aches. And I'd go to see the doctor, and of course it's the military, so they're pretty nonchalant about it, and they're like, "Oh, you're fine." They didn't do a lot of tests. And I was experiencing pain a lot. So it's the army, so you have to run every day. And I could not do it. I was on remedial PT. I was doing so that's like physical training, and I was doing that twice a day. And I was strong. I could do push-ups and sit-ups, but every time I would try to run, 2 things would happen. The first is that I would be in excruciating pain in my feet, and the second is that I would throw up, like, every time. If I was doing a PT test, which is a 2-mile run, I had to get used to just, like, trying to throw up while I was running so that I wouldn't mess with my time, and still, I would fail these PT tests. And that happened continually for 4 years. I couldn't pass a weight test, which was really difficult, and I couldn't pass a PT test, so I couldn't get promoted. I was well respected by my superiors, but there was really nothing that they could do. So when it came to the end of my 4-year enlistment period, I decided, this just isn't gonna work for me. So I got out of the army. I went back to school, for psychology, and at first, everything was fine. But the more I started getting involved in my studies, I started experiencing these very strange symptoms. Like maybe I would be in the middle of a lecture and I just couldn't comprehend suddenly what somebody was saying. It was like all of a sudden my professor would go from speaking English to speaking Russian, and I just could not take it in. And I would get so tired at the end of a lecture that I would have to go home and sleep. In between every class, I would try to sleep, and then I would sleep all night long, and I just didn't have the energy to do anything. And then one day I woke up and I just had double vision, which was a vertical double vision. And doctors at the time were like, well, that's not a real thing. Vertical double vision isn't real. And if you're experiencing it, it's a psychological symptom, not a biological symptom. And I was extremely frustrated already. I was scared. I didn't really understand what was happening. And I went to my primary care physician, who ended up being a wonderful member of my treatment team. And at first, she was kind of like, well, I think the two most likely culprits based on your symptomology are a brain tumor or multiple sclerosis, which at 22 was overwhelmingly scary to hear. So that kind of started us on this journey of MRIs and CT scans and poking and prodding, and nothing was coming up. There was like some maybe minor abnormalities, but they couldn't figure out what would be causing my symptoms. And so I kept kind of going to school and trying to make things work at the same time that I was just going to see different doctors all the time. So I would go to school, and then on the days off, I would travel to a different town and see a new neurologist. And that was really difficult because, and it's something I think a lot of people with disabilities can relate to, is this feeling of being disregarded or treated like I was exaggerating my symptoms or lying about my symptoms. I had the first neurologist I ever saw just flat out told me I was depressed. And at that point, it was about 6 months into me seeking treatment. And at the time, I wasn't relating any of the symptoms I had in the military to what was happening at that time. And so I'll never forget, because he said, um, "You've been sick for 6 months. Why don't you call me when you've been sick for 6 years?" And I just broke down crying in his office. And he took that as a sign that I was depressed, that I was hysterical, and really just disregarded my symptoms. But he did decide to do a lumbar puncture just to kind of rule everything out. And then he found it took him like 40 minutes to be able to access my spinal fluid, because there was so much scar tissue buildup around like my spine and my spinal cord. And they couldn't figure it out. So it was years of going to see doctors at Johns Hopkins, doctors all around Montana, and nobody was able to pinpoint it. I mean, I was diagnosed with probably 10 to 15 different diseases, and we would start treatment for these diseases, and they wouldn't help. I would just get worse. I found that the pain in my legs and my feet were such that I couldn't do any of the activities I used to enjoy. So I couldn't ski. I used to downhill ski or water ski or knee board, none of those things. I mean, the minute I would try to do it, the pain was excruciating. And those same symptoms of nausea all the time, throwing up constantly, my entire digestive system was in constant upset. And I was experiencing just pain, like whole body pain. My joints hurt. My eyes hurt. It was like my whole body was just refusing to function. And it, the, the more I pushed, the harder it got. So I was able to get my way through college. So all the way through college, same thing. Doctors weren't able to figure out what was going on. They knew it was something. They just didn't know what it was. And so I graduated college. I got a job as a youth case manager, which I really loved. And then I kind of stepped that up to be a child and family specialist, which was going into homes and working with parents and children who were having difficulties connecting and kind of helping parents build their skill set to find ways to connect with their children. And we were doing that for Head Start kids. So in the morning, we would have the kids come in and we would work directly with the children. And then in the afternoon, I would go into the homes and I would work with the parents and the kids. And it got to the point where I could only work maybe 2 or 3 days a week, and I was having to call in sick the rest of the week because my body just couldn't handle it, and it just wasn't working. Um, so left. I went to a different job that I thought was gonna be less physical, and I thought that would be the solution. But I found that just even the emotional stress of working a job that was pretty rigorous, my symptoms continued to get worse. And I would gain a bunch of weight from being on prednisone, and then I would lose a bunch of weight for reasons we didn't understand. And I was seeing a rheumatologist who's been really she was a wonderful, wonderful doctor. And one day, we had been discussing, um, some of my symptoms because I had lymph nodes in my whole body were, swollen all the time, so that was causing a lot of pain too, a lot of pain and pressure. And they had decided to remove one of those lymph nodes to rule out lymphoma. And my doctor had kind of said, "We're positive you don't have lymphoma because if you had lymphoma, as long as you've been sick, you'd be dead. But everything about your symptomology looks so much like lymphoma. We just have to rule it out." So they did that procedure, and a few months afterwards, we were talking, about my symptoms again, and my rheumatologist said, "There's this disease that's called IgG4 related disease." And it was really only discovered as like a comprehensive disease process in 2003. So it's so new. Most doctors haven't heard of it. They don't know how to diagnose it. There's a whole bunch we don't know about it. But she said, "I just attended a lecture by the guy who discovered it. And the more I think about it, the more I think it fits. So let's run that biopsy that we took and see if it matches up." And lo and behold, it did. So that was kind of the beginning of us even just understanding what my disease process was, and that was like a 10-year process of just seeing doctors and trying to figure it out. So once we got to that point, I was able to at least get on appropriate treatment, which is pretty intense. It's mostly like prednisone and then different forms of chemotherapy over like different periods of time. So by the time we had figured out what my disease actually was, I had already left the workforce. I had already just decided there was no way I could keep doing it. Um, and so we have kind of continued to shift treatment as we could at the same time that I was finding I just kind of financially couldn't stay in the same place. So around 2018 was when I was finally approved for disability. And that was right around the time I realized, okay, there's no way I can afford all this. There's no way I can afford my home and my treatment, which at the time was including physical therapy twice a week for the physical symptoms, the chemotherapies, and also just therapy for kind of dealing with this disease process that nobody really understood what it was going to mean or if I was ever going to get better. Um, and the consensus kind of is once you have damage to your organ systems, there's really no going back from that. So at that point, it's just saying, okay, how how much can we stop the progression any further? So my journey through the disability process was really it was a difficult one. Having worked for 2 years for disability determination services, I felt first I kind of had an idea that it was going to be difficult, that getting support from the government or being able to live in any sort of comfortable way without working beyond what my body was going to be capable of was going to be really hard. But I really thought that with the understanding of the system that I had an upper hand. And what I found is that I just didn't. There was no wiggle room, especially at the base levels of applying for those disability services. Um, and it was 2 full years before I was able to get that support from SSI or SSDI. And in the intervening years, it was one of the hardest struggles I've ever experienced. And it was just a constant feeling of eh, it's really confusing because on one hand you have to prove that you're disabled. So it's helpful and harmful in that it really does force you to internalize what it means to be disabled. And it's really interesting because so much of our society talks about like person first language, that you're not a disabled person, you're a person with disabilities. But at the same time, if you are, and I considered myself a disabled person and not a person with disability because it is so much of who I am and how I see myself and how the world sees myself. And I think it's really important to not have to marginalize that half the time and then own it half the time. So those 2 years were really just about kind of figuring out how to advocate for myself and how to understand what it meant to be disabled and how to sit with that in a way that was okay when the government and some of the people around me kept telling me that it was not okay or it was not enough or I was not sick enough or that my disease process wasn't understood enough. And even after that, so at the end of that 2 years, I did get SSDI, and in the intervening time, I did have Medicaid, which was wonderful, right? Because I didn't have any income. So for those 2 years, there was no income whatsoever, and it was constantly fighting to be like, "Do I have things I can sell? Do I have people who can help support me?" But at least I had medical care because Medicaid covered all of that. But then I shifted to Medicare when I got SSDI, and that was really an interesting shift as well because all of a sudden I had this identity as a disabled person that was really accepted by the government, by my peers a little bit more. It was like that label of disabled. All of a sudden, because it came from the US government, it became real. But at the same time, I lost a lot of my ability for healthcare because the difference between what Medicaid covers and what Medicare covers and the amount that you have to pay into those became, eh, really it stopped my ability to, like, get medical care. For me, understanding the connection between disability justice and climate justice is a really kind of personal journey because of course being 34, I grew up hearing about climate change and kind of recognizing that in these little ways, but understanding the ways that it impacts us in these broader senses has been really new. And one of the things or the ways that I think it connects is it's a little bit maybe um what's the word? Oh, I'm really sorry that I'm spacing out the word I want right now. Um, maybe nebulous, I guess. So it's a little bit hard to grasp is this concept that where I live in Montana, it's really pretty pristine compared to a lot of other places. And we don't experience some of the other pieces of climate change that the coastal regions of the US and other parts of the world are seeing. But what we have been seeing is really an influx of people who no longer want to live in those places and see Montana as kind of this form of escapism. And so that's mostly very wealthy, very affluent people who are buying very large pieces of property in Montana, and that kind of shifts the economic landscape of where we're at. And it has forced a lot of people, and I think primarily the lower socioeconomic classes, which, as you know, really affects people with disabilities disproportionately, to not be able to live in the communities that they once were. So there are a lot of towns in Montana or cities in Montana that used to be really affordable that no longer are. And that's the position that I found myself in, is that as there is an influx of people to Helena, where I used to live, it became wholly unaffordable for me to live there. And it's a little bit hard to see the way that that's connected to climate change, but I think when you speak to people who are coming to Montana, it becomes a little bit clearer because there's this need that people feel to connect with nature and to connect with parts of the world that we're losing really, really quickly because of that climate change. And in those people kind of seeking access to those things, which um, like I said, is really only available to people who have the money and the resources to relocate as they wish to find those things. That then forces those who have lived here for, for their lives to have to reshift, and think about how they're going to live differently and more, maybe a little bit more marginalized than they once were. So when I think about wildfires and climate change, that is one of the biggest things that I think Montana has seen growing up. We always had summer wildfires. That's always kind of been a thing, but as I've gotten older, they have gotten more and more and more and more intense. And I remember in 2017 especially, there was like a month and a half where you couldn't see the sky, you couldn't see the mountains, you couldn't see anything, and the sky was just a bright red for the entire month. And I mean, the ways that that can impact our bodies is just it's overwhelming because not only can you not breathe, right? You can't go outside on days like that, especially if you're sick. I mean, even healthy people are unable to function normally in that kind of environment. But when you have a disease process that limits your ability to function and you add that piece to it, it gets dangerous and scary really fast. But then you also look at the mental health piece to that. Um, it's kind of overwhelming. It was really overwhelming to me. It felt like it almost took me out of my body. It took me out of, feeling like I understood anything around me because those pieces that I've always sought as like safety and comfort, which is the outdoors, is the mountains, they they were gone. Um and those pieces have just gotten worse and worse and worse every single year, and it's overwhelming to kind of think about how many spaces in Montana have seen these dramatic wildfires and how many places are still at risk, and what that means for these little tiny farming communities and agricultural communities around our state. Wildfire season is crazy because you lose all of it. I think that's what it is in the biggest sense is, I mean, it's the fear of loss of life and the loss of home and the loss of safety, right, that comes with wildfires. And also just the feeling of loss of connection. And I think that's that piece when I spoke about that red sky for 30 days. It felt very much like I was on Mars or something. It was like all those pieces of earth, of home. They we're all gone. So it's not even just, yeah, the Milky Way is completely gone. Stars are completely gone. The sun is almost completely gone. Um, all of these things that bring a sense of like safety and connection are just gone, just disappeared. And it's this fear that comes around. In one sense, it's kind of metaphorical because when I'm in the city and I'm looking at the sky that's blood orange, there's this hope that once the fire is gone, everything good will come back. The mountains will be here again. The sky will be here again. But there's also this like growing fear and recognition of the fact that that's not necessarily true. That we've kind of found ourselves in this position where these fires are, and not just in Montana, but we're seeing it in so many places in California and in Australia, that they're decimating the landscape, and they're affecting our world in such a way that we might not get back at the end of it what we had before. And I think that's what's really like scary in my soul, if that makes sense. Thinking about, what I would like to see different in terms of disability, and that like where it comes together with climate justice, it's a hard and confusing question, and I think it's one that a lot of us are really stuck on and stuck with. I think for me, there's this feeling of desire for community and a return to community that I think is going to be really important when we look forward to kind of making not just my life better or the lives of my friends and family better, but the lives of, you know, all of us and the existence of the earth. If we want to make that kind of less scary as a horizon, I think we really need to return to a sense of community and acceptance of one another. We have really, I think, found ourselves in a space where self-preservation has become really, really important. And that's really understandable, I think, given, I mean, 8 million different pieces that kind of play into all of these things that we're talking about today. Um, and I think it does a real disservice to ourselves and to others when we kind of separate ourselves. And in taking the time to understand other people's stories and other people's points of view, I think there's a lot of value that goes beyond just one, like those personal connections in that. I think there's something that kind of spreads outwards. And so just taking the time to learn about each other a little bit more and to understand one another a little bit more, I think that is this really amazing stepping off point that can kind of grow healthy environments for nature and for communities and for families. And I think that's, for me, what it all boils down to are those two concepts of connection and community. I think disabled folks have this innate resilience that is profound and really special, and this ability to kind of pivot and to make changes on the fly and to say, okay, I can't be in space A anymore. Space A is gone. Space A is not an option. So what are space B, C, and D going to look like? And how can I make that viable? And how can I make it successful? And how can I make it beautiful? And I think there's something about that kind of lack of option that disabled people find themselves in that is really powerful and can be really, really beautiful if given the chance to kind of create from that space as opposed to having to kind of just like fight from that space, if that makes any sense. And I think the lower socioeconomic classes have a vantage point of things that maybe the wealthier members of our society don't get. I think with money comes an ability to kind of ignore. I think that's this idea of like where privilege comes from, and not just like white privilege, but able-bodied privilege or wealth privilege. Um, there's this ability to kind of like shield ourselves from what's happening around us, and it's understandable. But when you have a disability or when you don't have any money, you lose that privilege, right? You're kind of forced to see the world as it is, and to kind of find ways to make it work from reality as opposed to from like this space of hope. And in some ways, that's really sad, right? That we have so much of our population that doesn't have that ability to like live from this really hopeful place. But there's also this like beauty in that of saying like this is where I'm at and this is how I'm going to make it work. And so I mean there is still hope in that. It's just a different kind of form of hope. And I think that that really like harsh open-eyed look at where we're at is really really important to move forward in any kind of honest and realistic way. I think the hardships that have come with disability have, yeah, absolutely created, a need for compassion. I think first for myself, right? The ability to hold myself with love and my life with love and acceptance, and from that has grown this ability to hold others with the same kind of compassion. And I think that is really, really, really important. When we look at all of the things that our world is going through right now, climate change and these racial injustices that our communities are kind of having to come to terms with right now, the ability to have compassion and to seek like honest connection is is really really important. And for me, that's kind of what the last couple of years have been about, is just being open to what everybody is saying and speaking, and kind of being okay with wherever anybody is at, and then sitting with them as they move forward in whatever shape that looks like. This kind of idea of radical acceptance of ourselves and of others. And for me, I mean, that's something that I'm still learning to do, and there are other communities within the larger umbrella of disabled community that are teaching me how to do that all the time. Um, Our Climate Voices is one of those. Disabled Hikers is another one of those communities that just like that's where I'm learning what it looks like to do this on a larger scale. Outside of just myself or outside of just my friends and family, what it looks like to do that as a part of a town or a city or a state or a country. Those are the pieces that I'm still kind of learning how to embody for myself. So mm. When I think about a world that kind of is inclusive to all of these justice pieces um, that we're kind of struggling with right now, I really it comes back to this idea of community and connection. I think these are the two pieces that we have kind of disregarded in our society right now. And I think that the more that we can come together with a kind of acceptance of who each of us are as individuals and the way that that can help us all grow as a collective, I think that's where this like magic space can happen, because there are so many people who have struggled with these pieces for so long and have so much wisdom that really haven't been given the voice to talk about it because they don't match up with like these ideas of success that we have. And I think that idea of like success has really hurt community, you know. So maybe there's some kind of piece in that of having to like let go of preconceived notions of success in order to like embrace one another where we are and kind of move forward together.
Hey everyone, this is Kari Slaughter, Director of Design at OCV. Thank you all for listening, and thank you, Callie, for taking the time to share your experiences and wisdom with us today. I had a great time mastering and scoring this episode. Thank you to Aletta Brady for interviewing Callie, and to Sanjana Acharya and Talia Fox for their editing support. As always, a massive thank you to the rest of the OCV team for their consistent and valuable support to our dedicated community. If you want to engage further with OCV, you can find us on Instagram at Our Climate Voices or on our website at www.ourclimatevoices.org. Stay tuned for 4 more episodes about the intersections of disability justice and the climate crisis in the coming months. See you then.